TorahCafe.com.
The subject matter for this afternoon goes to, of course, the core of the financial crisis that the world is presently enduring. And I think that the point for consideration is to what extent, if any, does the Torah take a view on money and materialism. And let's consider that maybe if there was some sort of directive that we would have followed within a framework of what the Torah itself indicates to us, that maybe we would not necessarily be where we are right now. So the question then is this, and to begin with, how did we get into this crisis? How do we get out of it? And I have to begin by telling you that I'm not a banker, in case you were hoping for some secret indication over here. I'm not a financial analyst. I've listened to presentations from some, but I'm not going to talk to you about subprime mortgages. I'm not going to talk to you about leveraging, liquidity, or market meltdown. I want to get to the core, to the spiritual essence behind it all, to reflect on really the biblical perspective on money and materialism. You know, I don't need to tell you, of course, one of the cardinal principles of Judaism is the idea that everything is bashert. In other words, that nothing happens just by chance. We're not some consequence of random quirks. We're not just simply mere victims of circumstance. We believe and we know that everything as it transpires in the material takes its root every bit also from the spiritual. Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, as otherwise known as the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, once said, we have a responsibility to live with the times, and by that, of course, he meant that you can look at the Torah portions of every single week. You can reflect on them and realize that they're not just a collection of stories of the past, but rather every portion, every story, every fine detail has within it some categorical life lessons that we can apply into our own everyday living. And with that in mind, and with keeping with the theme, I want to reflect just at the beginning of time. I want to look from the beginning of Bereshis, short little anecdotes of different little stories, just in the genesis of time when the world was first founded and how mankind made his way through life, to see some obvious parallels of then and now, and the lessons that we can learn therefrom. Let's begin with the portion of Bereshis. The portion of Bereshis tells the story of creation of the very first man and woman, Adam and Eve. And we know that no sooner have they been charged with the task and the challenge, the first ever that God presented them with, and they come face to face with their own frailty and their own mortality. No sooner were Adam and Eve given literally paradise at their fingertips, and they find themselves abusing it, as it were. For whatever the justifications and whatever all the different commentary analysis of what happened at that original point in time, that Adam and Eve chose to eat from that tree, the bottom line remains the same. He was given a blessing. He was given a gift, and it was abused. That sacred trust was abused. He lost sight of the purpose of that gift to the point where he becomes so self-indulgent. The way he figures, it's mine, it's for me to do it as I please. And no sooner does he do so, he is placed in this vast universe to engage with it, to safeguard it. In the words of the Torah, la'avda u'lishamra, to protect it, to safeguard it, to look after it as a sacred trust, to appreciate that what he has, everything he has in a wonderful paradise-type life is a gift from God. And when he abuses it, he comes to discover the temporal state of our physical world. Everything around us in life, he comes to realize, is really only temporary. Everything around us is what we call impermanent. Everything erodes, everything ages, and we need that. We need a sense of mortality, to realize that in the physical realm things come to an end. Everything around us erodes. Nothing lasts forever. And we need that. We need to appreciate that nothing lasts forever, because if we didn't, then we wouldn't appreciate the world as it were. We wouldn't be able to experience joy. We wouldn't be driven to go out into the world and to accomplish. We wouldn't even care to love, because why should we? We wouldn't actually cherish everything that we have, because I've got time. Everything's going to carry on forever. So in other words, plain and simply put, if we were to live forever, then we would not be driven and we would not be motivated to achieve anything. And yet in the midst of it all, we still seem to act sometimes without a care, without a sense of balance, without a sense and appreciation of what is true and lasting value. We behave sometimes with that same sense of, dare I say, arrogance that Adam did when eating from that tree, as though we're going to live forever. We act as though we are immortal, as though we are going to live on and on. And what does the Torah tell us? The Torah says, in the eyes of Adam and Eve, of Adam and Chava, were opened. In other words, they were riding high. They were living it up in their paradise, so to speak. And they lost a certain perspective, and they decided that they could do as they want, maybe stretch the boundaries a little bit, maybe acquire that little bit more than they were entitled to, maybe cross the lines that little bit more to have more, as they ate from that one tree that God said they should not eat to. And what happens? The next day they find themselves struggling. The Torah tells us God sends them out from the Garden of Eden. They lose their paradise. They have to start working the ground. In other words, they did not appreciate how good they had it. They weren't sufficiently aware of the blessings in their lives. And so, before they know it, they suddenly confront struggles and hardship. I think our world today, in this 21st century, is teetering on the brink. I think we've had it so good for so long that we've lost sight to appreciate what really matters. The world is in financial turmoil, and all of a sudden people are panicking. All of a sudden they're waking up to a certain reality that everything I thought I had that was going to last with me forever is no longer so. You know, just before Rosh Hashanah last year, I was in Moscow, home to the oligarchs. And the financial markets at the time of my arrival had in fact been closed for 3-4 days. I was there to deliver a lecture on the theme of the challenges of the Jew in the 21st century, but because of the current financial climate there at the time, then I was told that I should make sure that my talk should also include and address the credit crunch as well. And the one particular rabbi came over to me and he said, look, there are going to be certain very wealthy philanthropists in the audience. They're very charitable. They otherwise will never be seen at Jewish events. There are a lot of people like that. They don't necessarily do things Jewish, but they're very big in giving their tzedakah. But they're going to be here in attendance. They will be coming to this particular lecture. Even the rabbi himself was surprised to know that. But really the truth is that it doesn't come as any real surprise, because when people suddenly feel the pinch, when people are suddenly hurting, they come searching for meaning. I have no doubt that my shul, my synagogue, just as surely many others across the world, will have had an incredible increase in attendance during the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, because people were feeling that heightened sense of concern. And we all know, we're all human. We all come knocking on heaven's door when we are feeling that little bit more desperate, when maybe our bottom line gets hit, when the eye comes under threat. Human nature is conditioned with a certain kind of survival instinct which tells us that, well, we think first and foremost about ourselves. In the good times, as we look to accumulate more and more so that I can have more and more and I can have a better life, and even when in the struggling harder times when we're hurting. And let me make it clear, from God's perspective, He's not going to ask you, He doesn't mind why you call on Him when things are tough. That's okay. He'll also just want to know whether you were also there to thank him when things were going good. Fundamental to human nature is that when we're under threat, that's when we look to rediscover what we left behind. And what did we leave behind? A basic concept in Kabbalah teaches us that everything, again, like I said earlier, as it transpires in the physical, is really a reflection of the spiritual. If there is a physical recession that I suggest to you, a credit crunch, then there is also a certain kind of spiritual recession, or a spirit crunch. And when you think about it, it's an astonishing catch-22. On the one hand, we had become so self-indulgent in the physical, society became so caught up in material pursuits that we think, as in the words of the verse in Deuteronomy, it's my own strength and my personal power that brought me all of this prosperity. We tend to believe that the extra hours we're going to put in is really going to make all the difference. And on the back of that, we compromise on the essentials. We compromise on family, we compromise on religion, on so many things spiritual. And in the greater world scheme of things, that in turn triggers a material recession. You know, the Talmud tells us God already made up his mind at the beginning of each year, on Rosh Hashanah, how much we're going to earn during the course of the year. Yes, we have to make ourselves a vehicle, a channel, a conduit through which the divine blessing can be channeled to receive it. But even in so doing, we should never become indulgent to the point where the material pursuit overtakes spiritual responsibility. So in other words, it's precisely our determination and our obsession with material growth that generates a certain kind of spiritual recession, which in turn feeds back into the material as well. And if only we would be more focused on the spiritual, if only we would choose to express ourselves personally in our own way, in our own day-to-day living, each one individually and personally, whether giving more charity, especially when the temptation is there to cut back, or in whichever other way, then the material, I assure you, will take care of itself. Sometimes we need to look inside ourselves and ask, what has become my objective in life? He who has 100, says the Talmud, wants 200. He who has 200 wants 400. And so it goes round and round. Today's generation, I suggest to you, doesn't cry over spilled milk. They cry over spilled champagne. They don't complain about the lack of necessities, but the abundance of blessings. They moan over the frills, not the basics. Adam and Eve had 2 sons. The first was called Cain, and that comes from the root word kinyan, which means acquisition, which is the material dimension. The second son was called Abel, meaning Hevel is breath, fleeting breath, referring to the fragility of life. And it's precisely that little gasp of breath that separates the living from the non-living. You lose that breath, and you've lost everything. And our problem is that we look to compensate for the frailty of life by accumulating possessions. And the end result is that sometimes Cain kills Abel. The verse tells us, not on bread alone does man live. Rather, on all that which emerges from God's mouth is how man shall live. In other words, it's not just about the bread, it's not just about the materialism, but it's on everything that comes out of God's mouth. What came out of God's mouth? The 10 expressions with which he created the world. The 10 commandments, which form the core and basis for the rest of the Torah, with which he instructed us and the rest of society to go about conducting our lives. God defined our role and our purpose. Not on bread alone. It's not just in the material that man will be able to live, says the verse, but on all that which comes out from the mouth of God. In other words, the goal of Yiddishkeit is to combine the physical and the spiritual in balance. Every day, and especially on Yom Tovim, on the Chagim, we recite the Birchat Kohanim, the priestly benediction. And in there we have 3 parts. Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha, God should bless you and always keep you and watch over you. That, we are told, refers to the material. Yair Hashem panav elecha v'choneka, God should cast his shine upon you and be gracious to you. That, we are told, applies to the spiritual. Yisa Hashem panav elecha v'yasim l'cha shalom, God should raise his countenance towards you and give you peace. That is the notion of finding the right balance between both the material and the spiritual, whereby then we can achieve real stability and peace of mind and tranquility of spirit in our lives. That really is the lesson from the story, the opening story, the genesis of our world in the book of Bereshit itself. But I want to look at, after that point, what was considered the very first real recession, the very first credit crunch that ever transpired, as we know, in all of human history. And that we find when the verse tells us in the book of Lech Lecha, in the portion of Lech Lecha, there was a famine in the land. Vayehi ra'av ba'aretz, the Torah tells us there was a famine in the land. And then, as if that's not enough, a couple of verses later, the verse carries on and tells us, or reiterates in the verse, that the hunger was especially severe. In other words, it doesn't just tell us once there was a hunger in the land, but it reiterates again that the hunger was especially severe. No food, no economy, market meltdown. Now, several verses later, we suddenly read about how Avraham, managed to accumulate a tremendous amount of wealth. And so did Lot, his nephew. Avraham manages to retain his wealth. Lot loses it all. And we have to assume so because he barely escapes from Sodom with the shirt on his back. Let's consider the difference in their attitude to their individual acquired wealth. Early on, the verse tells us twice that both Lot and Avraham could not coexist. They couldn't get along together. Why not? There were some practical economic problems, but there were also some very real ideological differences. On the practical side, there wasn't enough land to accommodate both of them and their shepherds with their vast amount of cattle. Fair enough. But on the ideological side, we know that their approach to the materialism that they had acquired was distinctly different. We know that we're told Abraham's animals